if the only message you're sending to young men out of your gender resource center or out of your institution is, we're interested in talking to you as a man, but only if it's about your toxic masculinity, forget about whether or not it's right or wrong. I don't think it's pragmatic. What 18-year-old wants to feel safe in a space where they're immediately being presumed as toxic, right? Doesn't mean that that programming couldn't be valuable or couldn't have value, or that there aren't good versions of that. But it feels very limiting.
Matthew Stefanko is CEO and founder of a company called MANUAL, which is an innovative men's resource and engagement engine thoughtfully designed to meet the unique needs of men. MANUAL has a growing number of partnerships with colleges and universities, and in this video, Matthew shares a message that's important for people in the higher education community to hear. In your line of work, I know that you have exposure to men's programs that are put on by colleges, and there's diversity, there's variety among the kind of programming for men that colleges and universities are up to. I imagine that some of the programming is maybe just okay, kind of at least deserves credit for the school doing something focusing on the target population of males, whereas other programming kind of goes above and beyond. Can you talk about what those two categories would look like and what you'd like to see more colleges and universities do in terms of programming for their male students?
I have exposure to a few dozen schools that we work with directly, and then hundreds of more that I've interacted with. Despite that, what I think the kind of the public narrative is around some of the work we do around the LGBTQ plus community or Black and Hispanic students, I actually, at least from my perspective, think a lot of the work that we're doing out of LGBTQ plus centers, women's resource centers around Black and Hispanic students are really powerful motivators of change, right? And they're places that I do think are generating a really profound sense of community and belonging for a lot of populations that don't necessarily feel that way, right? And I think the challenge that I have around the way that some universities respond with male programming is that you just don't see that same level of nuance and thoughtfulness and depth of understanding, right, what is going on with that particular group of students, even though much of the data is often suggesting that those students are struggling the most to graduate, right? So, for example, our lowest graduation rate of any population is Black men. And I don't necessarily always think that institutions, and this isn't universally true, but that they're taking the same level of nuance, right? So, you might see out of a gender resource center a really fascinating and important complexity and depth around the programming that they're doing for trans students, or the programming that they're doing for their female students, or female identifying students, or whatever it might be. And then they'll offer one program for their male students, and the program is around toxic masculinity, right? It'd be the equivalent of saying the only value that the only thing we want to talk with women about on our campus is healthy eating habits or something, right? It's like, well, teaching healthy eating habits to any student would be a good thing. Might be a good thing for women or men who have disordered, eating habits, right? But if that's the only thing that you thought was valuable programming for your female students, we would find that to be like, aren't there other things that you'd want to talk about? Like, aren't there other ways that we can create community and space? And by the way, universities do a very, very good job of having that kind of nuanced programming for other student populations. I think where we fall apart, or where I see the difference between great programs and programs that I think are good but kind of leave a lot sort of lacking, is that depth and that nuance, right? So a program that I love is the Men of Color Academy at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. They're doing programs around brotherhood. They do have programs around masculinity, but they're also doing programs around personal finance and job and career planning, and ensuring that you can have successful mentor relationships, right? Like a lot of nuance and depth, and really understanding who these boys and men ultimately are, and trying to make sure that they're successful in whatever that regard is. So it isn't to say that programming around masculinity and having healthy masculinity and understanding that can't be valuable for 18-year-olds. I mean, we do have issues as it relates to male role modeling and the number of fathers we have and all these sorts of things, right? So the idea that colleges can be a positive force for educating around healthy forms of masculinity, personally, I think that's phenomenal. But if the only message you're sending to young men out of your gender resource center or out of your institution is, we're interested in talking to you as a man, but only if it's about your toxic masculinity, forget about whether or not it's right or wrong. I don't think it's pragmatic. What 18-year-old wants to feel safe in a space where they're immediately being presumed as toxic, right? Doesn't mean that that programming couldn't be valuable or couldn't have value, that there aren't good versions of that. But it feels very limiting, and it feels like a very limiting message. So that's kind of my distinction of what I've noticed of where I think colleges can just they need to do what they've already been doing, but just for this population, right? I think that's kind of my take on what I've been seeing.
Excellent. That's a very thorough response, man.
At least in the university context, I don't see a lot of negative intent around male students. It's more often it's just not a group they've been thinking about and paying attention to in the same way. I'm more met with, wow, I've never thought about it that way, or that's an interesting perspective that I haven't thought about, that I am like, yeah, I don't want men to succeed here. Like I don't get a lot of that.
Yeah, your position and having the insight that you have is unique. And so being able to speak to affirming affirming that colleges are interested in men, period, and then calling them to something even greater. And that's what your response did. And that's a unique perspective that you have because of the line of work you're in. And I think it's the right time to get that message out.
Men's work isn't foundational in the way that a lot of these other centers are, right? So like a lot of these other centers are endowed, or they have endowed faculty or staff, or they at least have like a line item, every year, unless we cut funding, every year the Women's Resource Center is going to get an allocation. Whereas a lot of the work we do around men is one off. Some guy had an idea that one year to do a men's group. He applies for funding. I would have thought, based on the way we talk about men in higher ed and universities, that no work was happening around men in college. And that's just not true. There's decades of stuff where you can find, but it's always, the story is almost always the same. Some guy was here. He cared about it for the 4 years he was here. It was really cool. He left. I'm not sure what happened to it, right? That's the narrative, right? So that's why like things like MOCA, well, obviously what we're trying to do with Manual, we don't even work with UW, and I talk about the Brotherhood Initiative all the time, but those things are actually like, they're fighting to create a foundation, right? Like they want consistent dollars from the institution. They want dedicated staff, right? Like some of those sorts of things. That's that next level of investment, right? Like we're going to have a center, like University of Oregon has a physical center, right? Like we actually have a place that we invest into, right? That kind of stuff I think that's what we need to be aiming for. This is a much bigger problem than like, hey, we're going to pay attention to this for 2 years. It just is, and so it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next few years. I mean, we did a partnership summit with a bunch of our current partners and a couple potential partners. We had over 100 university officials in a room on Zoom for 3 hours yesterday talking about this, right? I mean, it's the culture is definitely shifting. And I think people are recognizing that this is a problem. Richard's been an important champion of that conversation. I think we're doing a good job of having that conversation. So I think good things are coming in that regard.